of the living God, fall fresh on us.
Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on us.
Jesus passed along the Sea of Galilee. Jesus called the fishermen. Immediately, they left their nets and followed him. Reading today's gospel, the call from Jesus sounds pretty straightforward and simple. Jesus just happens to be passing by, calls some men, and they follow. There's not a lot of conversation or deliberation here. We are left with the impression that within minutes, their lives were changed. I'm sorry, but the 21st century skeptic in me is inclined to doubt the sudden transformation of these men. In all of my work as a priest, I have observed the way deep change takes time. Some quick changes can happen with concentrated efforts of a strong team. Other changes require multiple generations. Some changes that we desire never come to fruition. There are some people who doubt the possibility of what I like to call deep tissue change in one's life. It is possible, given our own relenting struggles and failures with desired change, to encounter this gospel as a useless story with little significance in our lives. If we doubt, and particularly sudden and profound change, then you and I might politely ignore this gospel message. Whenever I'm inclined to see a gospel as a throwaway story, I slow myself down immediately and ask the Spirit to work with me to help me hear what I'm not hearing or seeing. In our spiritual autobiography workshop, we just finished reading a book on Ignatian spirituality, as well as Ignatius of Loyola's spiritual autobiography. When I return from New York City in mid-February, we will begin to share a part of our spiritual autobiographies with one another. The invitation is not to tell our whole chronological story, but focus on just one or two events or persons that shaped our lives deeply. The invitation requires prayerful repose as we reflect with the Spirit at our side, trying to remember those times in our lives when everything changed and we came closer to Christ. For some, their lives are formed and given deep shape by a parent, grandparent, aunt, uncle, teacher, priest, or some other caregiver. For some, their lives are changed by one major life-changing experience. For some, their lives are changed by an utterly ordinary experience that just keeps going deeper with the passage of time. For some, a piece of art crystallizes their personal meaning and call. For some, a book, a poem, or a film profoundly shapes their life. Some of us, there is not one definitive event, but several experiences and persons that shaped who we are. Some yearn and struggle to hear the one definitive call, but never hear it. These people hear God's call in more of an unfolding series of events where doors open and close, open and close. Eventually, as doors keep closing, one door continues to stay open. As you see, there are many ways to receive our call from God. It is not always sudden and immediate, as it was in this morning's gospel. Change that brings us closer to Christ is usually deep and stirs us. I have learned that God speaks to each of us through what I like to call a highly personalized speech pattern that recognizes who we are, our history, context, and other factors. I think God knows that we all hear and learn in different ways. Some of us need to hear something over and over before we get it. Others need to hear something only once and they never forget it. For other people, it is helpful for there to be a series of trial and error before they hear what God is trying to say. Last October, Newsweek ran a story. The headline on the cover, "The Crises That Changed Pope Francis." The Newsweek story is wonderful and truly worth your time if you haven't read it. The story is a wonderful companion to today's gospel. Newsweek offers a glimpse into the life of Pope Francis, including his struggles to become a mature leader. We learn of a man who was once considered an administrative catastrophe that took, some Jesuits said, decades to recover from his leadership as a provincial in Argentina. We learn of a time in Pope Francis's life that fundamentally changed his life and his identity before Christ, the Church, and the world. The Newsweek writer states, "What is clear now is that Bergoglio emerged from that spiritual crisis an utterly different man. He had a profound conversion that reconfigured his understanding of the way God wanted him to behave. He developed a new model of leadership, one which involves listening, participation, and collegiality. When he arrived at his next job as assistant bishop in Buenos Aires, the old Bergoglio had vanished. He had transmuted from an authoritarian reactionary into the figure of radical humility who is today turning the Vatican upside down." End of quote. Between Pope Francis's story and the gospel, we have two very different timelines for change in our lives. Our goal should not be to fit our lives into either the disciples or Francis's timeline and call, but rather to reflect on those significant times in our life where our sense of purpose became very clear and aligned ourselves with Christ's message. The gospel and the Francis story offer a good reminder that the Spirit of God is always calling us to go deeper into the relationship with Christ. The disciples were probably master fishermen, but Jesus had another role for them. Francis was always a leader in the church, but God was not finished with him nor satisfied with him. The disciples and Francis underwent radical change in ways that opened them up to greater knowledge, love, and service of God. You know that wonderful piece of scripture that we are the clay in the potter's hand. We are the clay, and God is the potter. The image of God as the potter gives me great hope. To be clay in God's hand means that you and I are always in the process of becoming. At times we may feel we are stuck, but if we are open to the Spirit of God working through our experience, then we continue to grow. This week, a friend of mine told me a favorite quote of hers. "Every anxious moment is the opportunity for growth." I don't know about you, but I'm not on my best game being spontaneous. I plan everything. And I have a great spouse for that because we love to plan together. I have empathy for the disciples who were going about their daily work and what they knew well when out of nowhere Jesus comes along and what they knew well discontinues. Pope Francis had a clear path for his life and ministry, but God came out of nowhere and turned his life upside down. Sometimes a lack of spontaneity leads to resistance to sudden changes. Planning and discernment is good and spiritually prudent, but sometimes God's call is abrupt, without notice, and we just need to stumble along as we grow in our trust. I'm sure you're also familiar with the quote from Mother Teresa. If you want to make God laugh, tell God your plans. As I look back over my life so far, I did not always get to do what I planned to do or desired to do. Indeed, very few times in my life have things turned out according to my plan, but I still like to plan. The best times in my life have been those times that I have been able to get out of God's way and to come to see something different. Getting out of God's way to mold us into God's beautiful people requires we let down some of our armor. Our armor comes in a variety of forms through our anxiety, our resistance, our anger, our despair, and most often, our need for control. When we shed a little bit of our armor, we become a bit more available to experience the crazy, crooked lines that God paints in our lives. Crazy, crooked lines. Whoa. You won't be surprised for me to be a little confessional with you. As a little boy, I learned to color within the lines of the coloring book, though my great desire was to paint outside the lines. In kindergarten, I recall saying to my teacher, "It makes absolutely no sense to color within someone else's lines." In the Society of Jesus and in the Roman Catholic Church, I questioned authority of my superiors when their decisions seemed to be arbitrary. Good boys paint within the lines. Good Jesuits are obedient. There are so many structures of unity and order that have shaped all of us and the way you and I hear God. Many in this congregation have been shaped by the military or law enforcement. Good soldiers obey. Good officers obey the chain of command. And it is true that sometimes God follows the chain of command approach with us, and we are called to simply be obedient. But I'm finding, as I talk to more and more people about their spiritual lives, that God more often speaks to people through wild, crazy lines, disruptions, interruptions, and the crises of our lives. To be open, to be the clay, means that we are willing to give ourselves over to God, to be formed by God on God's terms and in God's time. The disciples and Francis gave their lives to God as they gave up their own plans and choices. Let us never stop turning our lives over to God. When we do turn our lives over to God, it may be a rocky journey filled with abrupt invitations, but if we hold on tight to God, the adventure will be well worth the ride. The good news of the gospel can be summarized by Dr. Seuss's famous title. You remember. It's a morning of remembering. Oh, the places we'll go when we follow Jesus and answer God's call. God bless you.